Welcome to the Verum Epiphania podcast, a serialized reading of the audiobook Verum Epiphania. Episode 7. Chapter 17. Into the Water. Without any thought as to what perils the child's screaming might portend, Stefan dropped the wagon's handle, seized his shepherd's crook, and crashed headlong into the trees. He scrambled through the trackless woods, tripping over gnarled roots and rotted logs, as the screams turned into sobbing cries for help. The forest seemed to conspire against him to block his path, assailing him with branches that tore at his clothes. But then, all at once, the woods verged onto a clearing, and Stefan emerged into a circular glade open to the sky. At the centre of the glade was a round, frozen pond, surrounded by lifeless ferns and reeds. At the centre of the pond stood a small, wide-eyed boy, much younger than Stefan. Next to the child, bleating as it struggled to keep its footing, was a tiny lamb wearing a collar and bell. The child now saw Stefan and pointed with a trembling finger to the edge of the glade. Stefan looked and spotted a great wolf crouched low on its belly, hiding in the withered undergrowth. Once again, an eerie sense of déjà vu overcame Stefan and compelled him to look high and low for more perils. Very soon he sighted them, 2 more wolves, lurking at equidistant points along the outer edge of the glade. Only much later would it come to Stefan why this grim situation had a ring of the familiar to him. But you might be able to guess if you imagine the scene from overhead. From above, the pond and the forest formed a circle within a circle, and the wolves, spaced evenly along the forest's edge, formed the points of a triangle. The scene was a deathly recreation of the Baron's mark. Stefan's legs began to tremble as the mortal peril of his newfound circumstances gripped him, but for now the wolves paid him no heed. Their alert gazes were instead fixed on the child and lamb. All were still for a long moment, and then the ice creaked in protest under its burden. The slavering wolves, sensing their quarry could soon disappear beneath the ice, began to lope in lockstep towards the pond. Once again, without a thought as to his own safety, Stefan raced into the glade. He darted between 2 of the startled wolves, stopped short at the pond's edge, then turned to face his adversaries. He shouted at them to stop and brandished his shepherd's crook at them, but this only caused one of the brutes to pause and hold Stefan's gaze, while the others continued their slinking advance. And so his foes worked together in this fashion to tighten their circle around their quarry. Very soon, Stefan was forced to step onto the pond's mirrored surface and gingerly inch his way next to the child and lamb. The ice groaned, and cracks branched like lightning beneath his feet. The wolves halted at the edge of the pond. It seemed they would not risk going onto the slippery surface, not when they sensed the breaking ice would soon force their meal to flee into their waiting jaws. The quaking child clutched tightly at Stefan's waist with one arm and the lamb with the other. Stefan crouched close to the child and whispered, "Merry Christmas," as if nothing was out of the ordinary. When the petrified child made no response, Stefan added, "I'm just trying to break the ice." At these words, the child gave a strange smile. Stefan held the child's gaze and said, "My name is Stefan. What is your name?" "George," the child replied in a clear but quavering voice. "I'm pleased to meet you, George," Stefan said softly. "How did you get here? Do you live nearby?" "I'm pleased to meet you, George," Stefan said softly. "How did you get here? Do you live nearby?" "We live," George said in a hushed tone, "just outside the forest. Someone took the wooden rails from our sheep pen. My dad said they took them to burn for heat, and several of our sheep escaped. My dad was mending the pen while me and my mum rounded up the sheep. I followed this lamb onto the ice, and then I saw the wolves." "It was very brave of you," Stefan told the child, "not to leave your lamb. You have undoubtedly saved its life. Your mum and dad will be proud of you. Do you think your mum is close by?" "I think so." "Then we should yell for her as loud as we can. She should be able to hear us, like I heard you. The wolves will not risk coming onto the ice, so we are safe here." The child nodded with relief. He and Stefan had scarcely opened their mouths to yell for help when the ice gave way and they tumbled beneath the pond's surface. Chapter 18. The Great Winter Night. The freezing water roared in Stefan's ears and stung at his skin like a living thing. He struggled mightily to overcome the shock of the plunge as he sank into the pond's murky depths. His feet soon touched bottom. He groped frantically in the dimness and found George was still clinging to him. But he could not find the lamb. Stefan tried to push off against the muck and propel himself upward, but it was no good. The wool clothes that had served him so well against the cold were now waterlogged and anchored him to the bottom. Unable to swim, he crawled on his hands and knees over slime-covered stones with George in tow. As he fumbled along the uneven bottom, he thrust now and then over his head with his shepherd's crook. Soon it struck unbroken ice, and a moment later the ground and ice converged as he reached the pond's edge. Stefan pounded on the ice with his crook and fists, but to no avail. His lungs burned and he fought the impulse to take a breath. He desperately felt along the shoreline for a gap that would let him pry against the ice with his crook. When he finally found one, he wedged his wooden staff into the gap and pulled down on his shepherd's crook with all his strength. His crook shattered, but so did the ice. Now, on his knees, Stefan pushed up with his back against the sharp shards of ice and cleared an opening for him and George to lift their heads out of the water. They both gasped eagerly at the freezing air, and Stefan tossed the remaining upper half of his shepherd's crook onto the bank. Then, with George still clinging to his side, Stefan grasped at tufts of shriveled reeds on the shore. With a Herculean effort, an agonizing pain accompanying every move of his deathly cold limbs, Stefan hauled himself and George, coughing and sputtering, out of the pond. When Stefan wobbled to his feet, he could see the bleating lamb barely treading water not far from shore. Shivering uncontrollably, he stretched out to reach the lamb with his truncated crook. After several clumsy attempts, he hooked one of the lamb's forelegs and hauled it into shore. As Stefan struggled to lift its limp form from the pond, his numb hands dropped the crook into the water. The wolves, meanwhile, sat watching with great interest as Stefan retrieved the rest of their meal from the pond. Stefan could scarcely breathe from the shock of the plunge, never mind yell for help. George and the lamb now lay crumpled lifelessly at his feet, too weak and cold to move. Numbness was spreading quickly through Stefan's body. Through his torpor, Stefan's sluggish mind conjured up a gruesome outcome of his new plight, something the cunning wolves already seemed to know. His adversaries had only to sit and wait patiently in their warm coats until Stefan was too weak to move. Then, with hardly any effort at all, they would tear him and George and the lamb to pieces. Stefan had to act now. He stooped jerkily to lift his companions and, as he did, a sharp pain in his side stopped him. A keen-edged shard of ice had frozen to his wool coat and hung from his side like a translucent blade. Stefan tore the jagged shard from his side and levelled it at his three antagonists. The wolves moved close together now, bristling and snarling deep in their chests at Stefan's threatening posture. While brandishing his icy dagger with one stiffening arm, he used the other to first drape the lamb over his shoulders and then cradle up George. As he did this, Stefan underwent, unbeknownst to him, a fantastical transfiguration. The bitter cold air was flash-freezing the water soaking him. Over his clothes, gleaming plates of icy armour took shape. Over his neck and at his joints, a rime of heavy frost knitted into a sparkling coat of icy chainmail. On his head, a shining crown of icy laurel leaves grew. Stefan looked, if not felt, every inch a great wintry knight. His armament, forged in the brutally cold foundry of the winter air, was more glittering, more intricate, and more breathtakingly beautiful and terrifying than any armament forged by fiery heat could ever be. The wolf pack quailed before the terrible splendor of Stefan, the great winter knight, and his glinting sword and armor. Their growls turned to anxious whines. Seeing their fear, Stefan advanced towards his adversaries on unsteady legs, his sword flashing in the air. the fearful wolves slunk away. Stefan backed across the glade, keeping his icy blade levelled threateningly at his wary foes. When he reached the trees, Stefan dropped his sword, gripped George and the lamb tightly, and plunged into the thicket. His icy armour was quickly stripped away by clawing branches. The wolves were emboldened at seeing Stefan flee, behaving and looking once more like prey, and they gave chase, as the boy threaded his way breathlessly through the trees and undergrowth. Stefan knew that if he caught his foot, or faltered or slowed, his assailants would be on him in an instant. Stefan emerged stumbling from the trees and lurched down the trail with the wolf pack at his heels. His stiff body was stretched to the breaking point by the time he reached his wagon. When he halted, the panting Mongols gathered around him, growling menacingly and baring their sharp fangs. Stefan tenderly placed George and the lamb inside his wagon. Then, in a desperate attempt to buy time for an escape, Stefan caught up his feathered cap in one numb hand and flung it at the wolves. To the starving brutes, the panache looked and smelled like a fowl, and they instantly fell on it with ferocity. While they fought over the boy's cap, Stefan bent clumsily to pick up the wagon's handle. But the cold and fatigue overcame him, and he swayed unsteadily. The wolves shredded and discarded the panache, made only hungrier and angrier by the decoy. Now they swung full upon Stefan with savage ferocity, mouths frothing and jaws snapping. Stefan's vision darkened and he swooned. The only hope for him and his companions now, Stefan realized, was for someone or something to intervene. And it was this thought of unlooked-for help that called the hunting horn to his mind. He tore the herdsman's gift from his belt and raised it to his blue lips. With his last remaining strength, he blew a long, steady blast. Then his world went dark, and his knees buckled. As he pitched forward, he cast the horn at the wolves. They fought savagely over it, working it fiercely with their powerful jaws. Then, once they had devoured the horn, the voracious pack turned their attention to Stefan's lifeless body. Chapter 19. True Wonders and Mysteries and Joy. During this time, George's mother, having secured the remaining sheep in their repaired pen, had been searching the woods for George and heard his cries, but it wasn't until Stefan's horn sounded that she could guess with any accuracy at his location. Now she flew down the forest path like a bird on the wing towards the sound. She arrived at the wagon just as the wolves were rolling Stefan onto his back and clamping their jaws around his throat and belly. Luckily, George's resourceful mother had armed herself with a fowling piece in case she flushed out a pheasant to supplement their Christmas dinner goose. She quickly fired off a roaring shot into the air. The startled wolves released their grip on Stefan and turned to defend their meal with flashing fangs and threatening growls, until a second blast of shot that whistled just over their heads sent them scampering into the woods. George's mother raced to check Stefan and George for signs of life, then she piled Stefan into the wagon and pulled it with all possible speed down the path. When Stefan came to, he found himself in a simple stone dwelling, lying on a settle and wrapped in coarse blankets. A bright fire of sweet-scented wood burned cheerfully in a rough hearth next to him. Arranged carefully on the plain mantel was a hand-carved nativity scene with an ox, a horse, a dove, a lamb, the three wise men, and the infant Saviour. At the centre of the room was a rustic but sturdy table, and seated at the table was George, looking healthy and happy, and his adoring parents. Stefan wondered briefly how he and George had been delivered here safe and sound, but then, still half dozing, he found himself absorbed with how George's mother and father administered so affectionately to their son, with such expressions of love. When the family noticed Stefan was awake, they crowded around him and embraced him, overjoyed, and heaped upon him an outpouring of thanks for saving George and the lamb. Then, George's mother ushered Stefan to a bedroom where he changed back into his clothes, which had been, like him, washed clean of their filth and toasted dry by the fire. Then Stefan rejoined the family around the kitchen table where George begged him to tell his version of the events at the pond, having already told his version at least 10 times since his parents had revived him. The child insisted on sitting on his new friend's knee while Stefan plunged into an account of the events at the pond, up to his last memory of the wolves wrestling over the hunting horn. When Stefan finished, George's father said thoughtfully, "It is such a rare chance for anyone to be on the Old Forest Road at any time, especially on Christmas Eve." "It is a miracle and a blessing, no doubt," George's mother agreed. Then she asked with great interest, "What was it that brought you to the forest?" Now Stefan, with great enthusiasm and detail, breathlessly recounted his errand to the village and his adventures in the forest and castle. When he had finished his tale, it was George's mother's turn to enlighten Stefan about how she had heard the blast from his horn, snatched him quite literally from the jaws of death, and raced home to warm him, George, and the lamb by the fire. "That is yet another strange thing," George's father said. "Wolves have not dwelt in these parts for centuries. The unnatural cold must have driven them, like the snowy owls, from their northern homes." Then they all agreed that the day had been filled with many strange events, remarkable chances, and undoubtable miracles. Then George's mother pushed back her chair and from a bubbling pot on the glowing stove brought everyone steaming mugs of punch. Once they were all seated with their drinks in hand, George's father made a spirited toast, giving thanks for Stefan and the miraculous outcome of the day's events. Very soon, Stefan's vexing thoughts of the day fell away from him, dispelled by the family's careless laughter and joy. Already the castle had receded further and further in his mind until it was a dim and distant memory. His doubts about Christmas that had haunted him in the forest evaporated away from him like the steam coming off of his Christmas punch. As they quaffed their drinks, Stefan found that the most common things, the chipped mugs and saucers and worn pots that lined the simple cupboards, captured his attention incomparably more than all the wonders that the castle had. The welcoming surroundings and familiar conversation held him spellbound. Every word and movement, it seemed to Stefan, was endowed with special meaning and great importance. It was as if the joy they derived from each other's company was not just a good thing, but the only thing that really mattered, or ever had mattered, or ever would. Stefan sensed that everything they were doing was part of a timeless script from an ancient play that engaged them not only with each other, but also with another presence. Their actions seemed to derive from an unseen vitality, a blessed influence that carried with it an emergent joy. Stefan became aware that he was a participant in something that seemed to resonate in harmony and verge with something divine. It felt to him as if their fellowship reverberated far beyond this modest dwelling, with a presence that was somehow infinitely distant and unimaginably old. Here, Stefan decided, were true wonders and mysteries and joy that the barons would never know. Here, and not in the company of the barons, was true privilege. This merry gathering in this simple cottage knew blessings and bounty the barons never would. Stefan was feeling fully revived now and back to his old self. His Christmas spirit, having been severely tested, had reawakened and was stronger than ever. True joy, he now knew with an ironclad certainty, lie in celebrating things like Christmas with friends and family. These thoughts of family kindled within him a longing to return to his own home. After they had drained their drinks, Stefan said he must be going. George's parents bundled Stefan into his coat, also dried by the fire, and then the entire family assembled outside to see him off. Stefan was relieved to see the dark forest and the Baron's Mountain were now far away, and that the narrow trail had given way to a wide, welcoming lane that wound and dipped through acres of well-ordered fields and manicured hedges. The day had got on. In the abiding winter twilight, Stefan could just glimpse a copse of trees in the distance that marked his family's farm. George's family embraced and thanked Stefan once more, and they all exchanged the sincerest wishes for a Merry Christmas. Then, with visions of sugar plums dancing in his head, Stefan struck off for home with the gait of an excited pup. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Verum Epiphania podcast.